The survey is pegging growth in the next financial year at 6.1 to 6.7%. Manishi Raychaudhuri, is that a reasonable forecast, or is that somewhere being ambitious given the challenges that still remain?
Well, I mean, if you consider that this year we are going to be somewhere between 5 to 5.5, possibly closer to the lower end of that range, then, to achieve 6% next year, there's one element of that puzzle that has to fall in place, and that is investments. Investments are about 35 to 37% of GDP. Traditionally, they were growing at about 8 to 9%, but over the last 5 or 6 quarters, the growth was 0. And so that straight away led to about 3% decline in the overall GDP growth numbers, which came down from 8.5 to somewhere close to 5.5%. So it's really that element, the investments element, that has to be kick-started. So, taken in isolation, these 6.1 or 6.7% numbers may not mean anything. One has to look forward to what are the steps that are being proposed to make that acceleration happen. So I think that investment acceleration, kick-starting the projects, that's really the key to this puzzle.
Let's also get on board Dr. Tirthankar Patnaik, Director Strategist Institutional Research at Religare Capital Markets, who now joins us on the show. Dr. Patnaik, to start off with, you've got the economic survey which has been tabled, and the note is that it's likely to grow at 6.1 to 6.7% in FY14. Do you think that this is rather optimistic?
Our numbers are fairly lower than this. We believe that FY14 numbers would be closer to 5.8%, and even here, if the government actually is serious about bringing the fiscal deficit down in FY14 to about 4.8% levels, that would, in their own method that they've done until now, cutting plan expenditure and essentially cutting down subsidies also in the near term, would mean a lower number there. So we believe that reaching a 4.8% fiscal deficit number could mean that growth could come down by another 25 basis points. So, come down to about 5.5%. So yes, to answer your question, these numbers do seem fairly optimistic.
But also, some of the other points raised by the economic survey are the fact that the oil subsidy bill is one of the biggest factors weighing on the fiscal deficit, and that needs to be corrected. But Swami, bringing it back to you, how, reasonable or rather how likely is it that it is going to get addressed in full force in a pre-election year?
If you mean the oil subsidies, I think it definitely will be addressed. The big test, I think, was, there's this idea in India that everything is cost plus. And if you increase the price of diesel, immediately inflation will rise. The really encouraging sign was that in January, when the price of diesel was first increased, the inflation rate actually came down. I'm not necessarily saying that will consistently happen, but it was, vindication that raising the price of diesel, especially in these amounts, is not something which sparks off inflation. Again, I think you'll find there's been no political ruckus, either after the January increase or February increase. That encourages me to believe that you are going to persist with monthly increases till as long as it takes to get that particular item under control, and that will substantially check the fiscal deficit. To the extent that it substantially checks the fiscal deficit, it reduces crowding out. It also reduces one actual element that was contributing to inflation and to the current account deficit. So, I think it has the potential to set off a virtuous cycle as against the vicious cycle that had set in earlier when the oil subsidy in effect just kept increasing and increasing as you had an increase in the world oil price and a depreciation of the rupee. I also believe that if you restore confidence, the rupee could strengthen somewhat. And if the rupee strengthens, that again reduces the amount of subsidy you have to give. That again is disinflationary. It brings down the pressures. So I am optimistic on this front. I also do believe that, our investment rate, which people talk about, the CSO projections so far do not show a collapse in investment. They show some limited increase in investment. The real problem is that this investment is not translating into production. So that really means that the problem is not so much the amount of investment, but the productivity. And the question is this fall in productivity something that is going to be sustained? I don't think so. The fundamental long-term drivers of Indian growth, the increased productivity and demographics, they are still in place. I think there's a lot of possibilities of improving productivity. Now that you see the government seized of a number of issues that have come up in clearances, now that I see a number of small moves to reduce the delays here, reduce the delays there, I think there is every prospect of productivity improving. And if productivity does improve in the coming year, surely growth should pick up to 6.5%. I do not think it's difficult.
We've also got Dr. Bimal Jalan, former governor of the Reserve Bank of India, joining us. Dr. Jalan, if you just heard Swami talk about the internals of the fiscal deficit, which essentially ought to be what everyone should be looking out for, do you believe the concern will be in terms of how the finance minister has achieved 5.1%, which is the number that the Eco-Survey is throwing up, and not 5.1% itself?
Absolutely. I mean, what Swami had said is absolutely right, that you have to see, exactly how it has been achieved. And it's certainly a surprise, a positive surprise, a welcome surprise, because there was a doubt whether he would be able to achieve 5.3%. And if he has brought it down to 5.1%, we couldn't ask for more. But, I mean, the point made by Swaminathan is also absolutely correct, that where the cut has taken place, is it postponement of expenditure, is it what you might say revenue expenditure, or is it capital expenditure which has been deferred or which has been cut? So this has to be studied more. But all told, even if in the worst case scenario, the fact that 5.1 could be, some adjustment may have taken place, postponement may have taken place, is much better than what we would have thought, say, last week, when the finance minister had expressed a determination to keep this particular target of fiscal deficit, of 5.3%. So, it's a very welcome, what you might say, development.
We've also got Naina Lal Kidwai, president of FICCI, who now joins in on the show. Thanks very much for being with us. To start off with, we have the growth projection this time around coming in at 6.1 to 6.7%. What's your assessment of that? Because we've been talking to many experts, and Swami, for one, believe that, there are a lot of constraints which still linger on the production side, that we do need to get growth going, and then the rest of the problems, such as consumption and savings, will take care of themselves.
I think the fact that there is this 1% at a minimum increase from this year that is projected is not out of line what the street and research analysts have been saying as well. If you look at projections, by and large, they are suggesting growth somewhere in that 6.5% level next year. So in itself, this is not a surprise. And there are, in fact, remedies which suggest that this is possible. Aside from GST, which of course implementation and dates are still an issue, in which we firmly believe would add 2% to the GDP of the country. But if you set that aside, you look at the I-core of the country, the incremental capital output ratio, which has actually deteriorated from a sort of 4% mark to 5% this year. This is money that is already spent but is not yielding results because projects are stuck. If we could get these projects sorted out, we could see growth come back very quickly, because it doesn't need liquidity, doesn't need additional funds, it just needs policy, regulatory sort of issues getting resolved so these projects could move forward. So there are some of these. We could feel some of the effect of the reforms, whether it's FDI and retail and such like, also beginning to kick through. And the indications of green shoots, as we're seeing it, while there has clearly been a slowdown in terms of IIP numbers, there are also indications in terms of the PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index, over the last couple of months, which is suggesting an uptick. So I think there is enough there to suggest that we could go up.